So this is a video for teachers. I'm just going to explain a couple of different ways I teach forms to students using clay. The tools I'm using today are a rolling pin, a wooden dowel that I got for the scratch-off art that is designated now for clay. When it gets dull, I just put it in the pencil sharpener, and a popsicle stick used for cutting. So I have a cutting tool, a scratch tool, and my rolling pin. The first form I'm going to go over is a pinch pot. So I do this with kindergarten as the project that they save and put in the kiln. I have them make a snowball, so they're rolling the clay in between their hands to get started. Anytime that they see, sometimes when they're rolling, they get like a little area that pops out like this. And so I just tell them to press that on the table, and he points, press them back in on the table, and then continue rolling in a circular motion. If they have any seams or bumps, they can use their fingers to smooth it out, and it doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be pinching it a lot to change the shape. Next, I'm going to tap it on the table to make a flat spot. That's going to be the top edge of the pinch pot. It helps make the rim a little bit more even. So rest it in my hand with the flat spot up, and then in the middle of that flat spot, I'm going to press my thumb all the way down to make a well. I didn't go through, just making a well. I'm going to take like a claw shape of my hand and go around in a circle, pinching a little bit each time. I'm going to go around lots of times. So each time I pass, the walls of the pinch pot get a little bit thinner. And because I made the top flat, I should have a pretty even rim. I can tap it on the table so it has somewhere to stand. And then I can use my fingers to add texture or decoration to the outside of my pottery. Every time I do something to the outside, I'm also holding it on the inside. So like this, inside, outside, like this, inside, outside. I can pinch the clay out, I can push the clay in, anything you want. You can really work. Some kids really like to spend the whole time smoothing it out and perfecting the surface. And that's cool too. They'll ask if they can add on like handles, or they'll try to stick other pieces of clay on, but I tell them that we don't have clay glue. We didn't learn how to use clay glue yet, so the pieces will fall off in the drying process, and I encourage them to stick to just this form for the kiln. Next, I have coils. So I always make a day where the kids, I tell them, roll out your clay into coils and then see what you can make to kind of practice rolling. It's challenging for them to get, so I'll break off a small piece, start it in between my hands, so I have kind of like this kind of a shape, and then I roll it on the table. I tell them from the palm of their hand up to their fingertips and to go slow. They'll take the coil and they'll go like this, and they expect it to come out perfect, but what happens is it flops around and it breaks. So go slow, and I'm trying to press where I notice that it's taller. Where it gets skinny, I'm not going to press. Something that happens when we roll coils is lots of times we get like an oblong shape and it flops. So to stop, notice it, use the table to kind of press it back into place, just like we did when we were making a snowball. Make sure that we're keeping it wet, because when it dries out, it is likely to break as well. And then go like that. I'm rolling back and forth and slowly stretching out as well. Once they get some coils made, I'll ask them what they can make with it. Are they going to make pottery? Are they going to make a sculpture? And they start to kind of wrap it around in this snail kind of form, which is also going to be the way I teach them to make the base of a coil pot. They will start to put them into rings and stack them on top of one another, which is the simplest way to make the walls for a coil pot and to start building them up. Or they start like braiding and twisting them together, so that's cool too. The second time I see them, I'll ask them to make pottery with it. So we will spend a lot of time talking about attaching each piece, and at that point they're using the scratch tool and they're using water to make sure each coil is really well stuck together. I also then do slabs. So I give them a much bigger piece of clay because we have to roll out a slab that's large enough to cut down into a perfect shape. So I tell them to push it with their hand first. This is really challenging. I have to stand to do it lots of times. So push it with my hand first to get it started, and then use the rolling pin. Same thing as when we were rolling coils. It's like from the the heel of my hand to my fingertips. And a lot of times here, the kids will roll right off the slab and make kind of like a narrow section. So I tell them to stay in the middle. And same thing with coil, is to go slow, think about what you're doing, observe what's happening. Where it's thicker, that's where I want to be pressing. And once they get a big enough shape, they can cut some rectangles and squares out to build a vessel. If they want to do a square vessel, a simple way would be cutting a long rectangle. And I'm just using my scratch tool to cut here. You could also use the popsicle stick. I use this more with the figure, but that's fine. Either way. And then I can bend the rectangle up on two sides. So now, really quickly, I've created a bottom and two walls. And then all I have to do after that is cut, I don't know if my piece is big enough here, but cut two more walls and add them on. Once they get their pieces all cut and measured, they're going to spend time scratching to attach. So I teach them to make tiny X's with their scratch tool on both sides. We don't use slip. I just have these baskets with a damp sponge. So they take some water from the sponge by just pressing their fingers onto the sponge and then stick it together. To make these really strong, I'm going to teach them to stitch the clay together. So they're going to actually be dragging the clay across the seam to make it completely smooth. Another way to do a slab construction is to roll it out into a really long slab, which I say instead of rolling in every direction, we're trying to stretch it in one direction, so just back and forth a lot. And I'm going to make a cylinder. So I'm going to cut my really long rectangle. It doesn't have to be perfect because you're going to shape it anyway. And then I can bring the two ends together. And that is a really quick, easy way to make a vessel. This clay is really soft. I don't even have to. Some teachers don't do slip and score at all. You can just stitch the clay all the way together and make it one. And you should not have a problem with cracking. With this, I tell them to support on the inside while they press on the outside so it doesn't collapse. That can be quite challenging for some kids, but yeah, just work on that until you have something you like. And if I want to make a bottom, let me see if I can make this big enough to measure. Also, the slab should be about the size of their finger, the thickness of their finger. Too thin and it's going to be really fragile. Okay, so for the bottom, I just put the cylinder on top and trace around. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because you're going to be smushing the clay around anyway. This is just an introduction to form for them. And I'm going to go around and drag that clay all the way up. Again, I didn't do scratch and attach here. If it's completely blended together, I think it's okay. What you want to avoid is having students do things like this without scratching and attaching. The clay is nice and sticky now, so it's staying, but once the surface dries and it pulls away from each other a little bit, that's going to come right off. And while the kids are working, I go around and I kind of give it a little tug. And if it comes right off, I'll tell them you need to scratch that back together to make a stronger connection, and that should hold. They don't always have to smooth things out if you're providing a scratch tool. Okay, next, figures. Figures can be quite challenging because of balance, especially if they're trying to make some really skinny legs or really skinny arms. So a way I learned from Nancy Beal is to start with kind of like a potato shape, break a little bit off that you'll use for arms. So I'm going to actually roll that into a kind of a thick coil, probably tell the kids the size of their thumb or bigger. And then I have kind of this potato shape. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We don't want the kids kind of fussing over the surface, what that's going to change anyway. Make a narrow spot. So now I have a head and body. I can use my cutting tool. This is where I like to use the popsicle stick, especially if I do this with grade 1. I'm not going to give them the pointy tool to kind of drag through. I think it's harder than this is more like a knife. So I'm going to use my cutting tool to separate the bottom. And now I have 2 legs, and I can use that same pinching action I learned with pinch pots to pinch these sections into legs. So right now I have a body, 2 legs, and head. Now I have my coil I can add for arms. At this age, for the younger kids, for first grade, I don't teach scratch and attach. They don't have scratch tools yet. So I tell them any piece that you separate, you have to join all the way back together. No different pieces, because they will fall off, like I just explained with the handle. So even though this was broken apart, now I have to put it all the way back together and pretend it was one piece this whole time. Again, I'll tell them we don't have clay glue. We didn't learn clay glue. So they have to blend everything together. And they can do that. So now I have the 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. I can squeeze my clay to make it taller or thinner, longer pieces, and kind of just go from there. I also can change this really easily into an animal by putting the legs forward, the arms forward, and the legs forward, and lifting the head. Now we have a 4-legged animal. Again, since we're not adding separate pieces of clay, what we want to avoid is like tail, because that's just going to fall off when it dries. So I teach them to kind of smush the clay to make things like a tail. They can pinch to make ears. They can poke to make a face. At this point, I'll also come around with the scratch tool and ask if they want to add any texture. So some of them will go around and do like fur, or they'll use this tool to make eyes or a mouth. And yeah, that's pretty fun. Claws. So that's it. The last one, actually, to make a base. Sometimes if they want to attach their animal to something, first write their initials and their class code on it, then flip it over, and then we can scratch to attach this together to create a solid piece. And that's it.